Okay, we are now recording.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I am Cathryn Merla-Watson. I'm an associate professor at UT Rio Grande Valley, and I am co-chair with Cristina Herrera of the Latinx Literature and Cultural Society. This panel is one of three thematic panels, and this one is entitled Gender, Sexuality, and Imagining Latinidad. Our first presenter is Lilian Contreras-Silva, who earned her PhD in comparative literature from LSU in 2000. She works at Hendrix College in Conway, Arkansas, where she is a professor of Spanish. She teaches courses on Spanish language and Latin American literature, and her presentation is entitled Reimagining Women into History.
Thank you. My paper is based on Ángeles Mastreta's short story collection, Mujeres de Ojos Grandes, which was published in 1990. And it tells the stories of many Mexican women in short stories. In these stories, the author details the lives of these women, how they lived, where they worked, who they loved, and what role they played in society. Like in her novels, Arráncame la Vida y Mal de Amores, the female protagonist functions as a way to highlight the long ignored role of women in history by making the protagonists diverse in interests, ideologies, and lifestyles. The space that is claimed is inclusive and accepting. The project of reinstating women into history as complex beings is antagonistic to the traditional view of Mexico's national identity. In the traditional construction of who a Mexican is, it is the male experience that is considered central in significance and in agency. As a result, Mastreta's push to acknowledge women's experiences and roles as important is a challenge to this Mexican identity. I think that to better understand the role of Mastreta's writing, and how it takes place in the discourse of national identity, it is important to think about the texts that demonstrate the traditional view of Mexico's national identity. And in Laberinto de la Soledad de Octavio Paz, published in 1950, the passive nature of women is expounded upon. When speaking of the nature of Mexican men, Paz states about women: prostituta, diosa, gran señora, amante. La mujer transmite o conserva, pero no crea, los valores y energías que le confían la naturaleza o la sociedad. En un mundo hecho a la imagen de los hombres, la mujer es solo un reflejo de la voluntad y querer masculinos. Pasiva, se convierte en diosa, amada, ser que encarna los elementos estables y antiguos del universo, la tierra, madre y virgen. Activa, es siempre función, medio, canal. La feminidad nunca es un fin en sí mismo, como lo es la hombría. This means prostitute, goddess, grand, lady, lover. Women transmits or conserves, but does not create the values and energy that nature and society entrust to her. In a world made in the image of men, women is only a reflection of masculine will and desire. When passive, she becomes a goddess, beloved, a being that embodies the stable and ancient elements of the universe, the earth, mother and virgin. When active, she is always functional, a medium, a channel. Femininity is never an end into itself, like manliness is. My translation. Clearly, in this view, the nature of women is to be a tool and a product, not an agent. In this way, the narrative of national identity of Mexico is based on the desires of men. In his seminal work, El Espejo Enterrado, published in 1992, Carlos Fuentes shares his thoughts on the culture and history of Latin America. In this book, he retells the history to create a narrative that leads to modern-day Latin America, a consequence and a product of the history that precedes it. His retelling of history, which has garnered much positive attention, pays particular attention to the history and culture of Mexico. In his version of history, we see the active minimization of the role of women. He gives us some information, for example, about Malintzin, otherwise known as Malinche, the indigenous woman who was the cultural and linguistic translator for Hernán Cortés during the conquest of the Aztec Empire. He tells us, pero un día le fue presentado a Cortés un tributo bien distinto, un obsequio de 20 esclavas, llegó hasta el campamento español y entre ellas Cortés escogió a una. Descrita por el cronista de la expedición, Bernal Díaz del Castillo, como mujer de buen parecer y entremetida y desenvuelta, el nombre indígena de esta mujer era Malintzin, indicativo de que había nacido bajo signos de contienda y desventura. Se convirtió en mi lengua, pues Cortés la hizo su intérprete y amante, la lengua que habría de guiarle a lo largo y alto del imperio azteca, demostrando que algo estaba podrido en el reino de Moctezuma, que en efecto existía gran descontento y que el imperio tenía pies de barro. My translation, but one day Cortés was presented with a different tribute. A gift of 20 slave women arrived at the Spanish encampment, and among them, Cortés chose one. Described by the chronicler of the expedition, Bernal Díaz del Castillo, as a woman that had good looks and the busybody and extroverted, the indigenous name of this woman was Malintzin, indicated that she had been born under a bad sign of contention and misfortune. She became my translator, tongue, because Cortés made her his interpreter and lover, the translator who would guide him throughout the Aztec Empire, showing that something was rotten in the kingdom of Moctezuma, that in fact a great discontentment existed and the empire had feet of clay. Fuentes later tells us that gracias a la Malinche, Cortés descubrió que un rey llamado Moctezuma vivía en una magnífica ciudad en la montaña. Thanks to Malinche, Cortés discovered that a great king named Moctezuma was in a magnificent city in the mountain. Fuentes then gives us 3 sentences about the information that Malinche shares with Cortés about the Aztec Empire. This information included the size of Moctezuma's armies, the number of allies of the empire, and its formidable size of the empire. In this rendition of history, Cortés chooses Malintzin out of 20 slave women because she is pretty, a busybody, and extroverted. From there, she becomes the translator and lover by Cortés's choice. La hizo, he made her. It is striking that although there is a nod to the type of information that Malintzin offered the Spanish conquistadors, the information that Fuentes lists was easily acquired and probably already known to the Spaniards. According to Bernal Díaz del Castillo, the same sources Fuentes utilizes, Malintzin was first given to one of Cortés's captains, Alonso Hernández Puertocarrero. It was when Malintzin's talent for language was noticed that Cortés took her from Captain Puertocarrero so she could serve as a translator. Her knowledge of the Mayan and Aztec language made her very valuable to the Spaniards, given their translator, Jerónimo de Aguilar, could translate only between Mayan language and the Spanish. Soon after starting her job as translator, she learned Spanish and became Cortés's sole translator. It is clear that Malintzin provided more information than Fuentes lets us know. She became a cultural translator, letting the Spaniards know how the Aztecs functioned as a society, giving information ranging from military strategies to how aristocracy saw itself. She actively participated in the conquest of the Aztec Empire by doing more than translation. She was able to give insider information, allowing the Spaniards to make the alliances necessary. In fact, her role was so vital in the process of conquest that the Aztecs knew Cortés by the term Malinche. In practice, seeing her as more important, thus giving him her name. By minimizing her role in the conquest, Fuentes builds up the role of Hernán Cortés in the conquest of Mexico, creating a narrative fantasy that history occurs because great men make it happen. In this endeavor, Fuentes is not doing anything new. Cortés himself never mentioned Malintzin by name in his letters to the Spanish crown. He also downplayed her role, and everyone else's, making himself the sole protagonist in the conquest of the Maya Aztec Empire. What is more, throughout the history of Mexico, the perception of Malintzin has changed depending on how the power structure has desired to portray her. At times, she has been depicted as a seductress and a schemer, completely morally corrupt and corrupting. At other times, Malintzin has been seen as a simple tool, as unaware and weak. In popular culture, however, she has been most often understood as a betrayer of her people, someone who sides with external powers. What is ironic is that although Hernan Cortés is seen as heroic for his conquest and even a sort of founder of the new nation, the woman who aided him is seen as a betrayer of the very same nation that was constructed through conquest. In this way, she stands as a perfect example of how women in women's roles have been misconstrued and diminished in the national narrative. The lure of this retelling is the simplicity and the linearity of this narrative. The simplicity lends itself to use for social political goals and for a feeling of inevitability in the current nation state, viewing history as a teleological project, one that is fated and therefore justified, minimizes all of the problems existing in current society. In this way, social injustices of the past can be excused as they were committed in the name of creating our present existence. Of course, with this excusal of historical injustices comes the lack of acknowledgement of the present day problems that they leave as our inheritance, thus maintaining the power structures of old. This is the historical narrative that the works of Ángeles Mastretta challenges. Even though this work predates the work of Carlos Fuentes of Mujeres de Ojos Grandes, her short story collection predates El Espejo Enterrado by 2 years, Fuentes represents the traditional view of the narrative national identity. In the works of Mastretta, women are placed back into this historical narrative. Through the personal stories of individual women, the silence that surrounds women in history is questioned and eventually erased. Women as individuals are therefore reinstated into the history and the national narrative. In this short story collection, the title of every short story is the first name of the protagonist, preceded by the word tia or aunt. Each story is a story of a woman, part of an extended family who is unique and known. The stories vary from that of women who choose to forgive their philandering husbands to those who choose to live life unapologetically independently. The story also vary greatly in length. The themes also vary, thus asserting the importance of small and large aspects of women's lives, everything from career to children, family, lovers, etc. In the interview article, Ángeles Mastretta, Women of Will and Love and War, Barbara Mujica, this is translated by Jeffrey Crespi. Mastretta talks about her depiction of women in her stories. She explains, regarding her fictionalized portrayals of Mexican women, she says, Mexican women are not getting to know themselves through these books. They're recognizing themselves as they are. They're not trying to become like the protagonist. They're realizing that they're already like the protagonists. Women were never before described in literature as they really are. What happens to me with respect to my book, Mujeres de Ojos Grandes, which is about women who lived at the beginning of the century, is that people come to me and say, it's really great that you wrote that book because I have an aunt who's just like that. But things like that were always kept secret. The possibility that women could take their destinies into their own hands and do with them whatever they wanted. Now, what I really do believe is that the closer women are to work, to having a profession and earning a living, the closer we are to doing whatever we want to do. Because if you buy the shoes you walk in, those shoes will take you wherever you want to go. End of quote. Clearly, Mastretta portrays her depiction of women in history as natural, obvious, and unproblematic. This explanation makes clear that in these works, staking out a place of importance for women's role in history is nothing more than making visible that which has always been present, though deemed unimportant. Even the titles of these stories, the familiar connection and the common first names, makes the claim that the stories are commonplace, though they are unique. Carmen M. Rivera Villegas, in her articles Las Mujeres y la Revolución Mexicana en Maldemores de Ángeles Mastretta, compares the work of various modern writers who focus their work on the role of women in history and popular culture. She lists various Latin American women authors who, through their works, han ganado el respeto y la admiración de una comunidad internacional de críticos y lectores que han reconocido justamente su talento. They have won the respect and admiration of the community of international critics and readers who have recognized justly their talent, and that these authors create works that serve a common purpose. My translation of the quote, a literary particularity that unites these writers is the act of feminizing the national historic space, which has been constructed, represented, and made sacred by the respective respective patriarchal societies. In using the word feminize, my interest is to highlight that these writers prioritize the psychology, the experiences, and the conduct of the feminine being in order to represent in literature an aspect of history whose representation has been exclusively reserved due to the supposed seriousness and critical professionalism of masculine culture. The social literary studies about women, sponsored by almost 3 decades of feminist movements, have proven that in history, which patriarchal culture writes with a capital H, women only appear in the lowest roles, disfigured by stereotypes and archetypes that blur their historical reality. And this is very easily seen in the narratives provided by the great writers Paz and Fuentes. In her story, Tia Rebecca, I will take one short story as an example. Mastretta introduces us to the figure of Rebecca Paz y Puente, who at the age of 103 years old lies on her deathbed. Although she is on the brink of death and has been for the past year, she stubbornly refuses to die. The story tells that Rebecca había sido bella como ninguna mujer de la época juarista, pero de eso ya no había nadie que se acordara, porque todos sus contemporáneos murieron antes de la revolución contra Porfirio Díaz. Así que el perfume de su cuerpo liberal, solo ella lo recordaba todos los días, y con el mismo brío que durante el sitio de la ciudad, la sacó de su casa a disparar una pistola de la noche a la mañana y hasta la rendición. She had been beautiful like no other woman in the Juarista era, but of that there was no one who remembered because all of her contemporaries died before the revolution against Porfirio Diaz. Therefore, of the perfume of her liberal body, only she remembered every day, and with the same energy that brought her out during the siege of the city to shoot a gun from night to morning and until the surrender. In one short part of the paragraph, the author tells us that the protagonist had been beautiful unlike any other woman. This in itself is a commonplace descriptor for women in the literature. However, in the next phrase, we come to understand that this beauty had been long forgotten. The next sentence lets us know that it was the liberal ideas that this beauty held that she remembered every day. A liberal of her day, she fought for a secular, progressive government. She helped defend her city from the autocratic forces of Porfirio Diaz by shooting at the enemy forces during the night. This description moves her beyond the norm of being a woman who's beautiful to a place where she is an active participant of history. Our frail protagonist was not always frail. She did not wait for history to happen. She was an active agent of history. And the story goes on to tell us that Tia Rebecca, my translation, she took 10 breaths per minute and seemed to have left weeks ago. Nevertheless, the force kept her alive, fleeing from death like from something much, much worse. This refusal to let go of life, as limited and as miserable as it was for her, confounds her children and her grandchildren. She tells her granddaughter in the end that no quiero que me entierren con el hombre. I don't want to be buried with that man. After her children and grandchildren recount the story of their grandmother. In her youth, in the face of her grandmother's silence, a granddaughter asks about the story about how Tia Rebecca had loved a fighter in the war, that he was killed during the siege of the city, that her soon-to-be husband had beaten and dragged her away from his body, and that she had then been married to him against her will. It was even possible that it was her soon-to-be husband that killed her lover. Under the weight of having been abandoned by her own husband, the granddaughter wondered how it was possible for the grandmother to survive the death of her love. Her response was that she did not want to be married to that man. She did not want to be buried to that man. And so the children acquiesced to give her her own grave, and the grandmother passed away. The granddaughter's lost husband found his way back to the funeral with apologies and flowers in hand, and he was met with an unexpected coldness and a statement of disdain. ¿Quién te llamó a un funeral? Saca tus flores y vete. Yo no quiero que me entierren contigo. Who called you to the funeral? You take your flowers and go. I don't want to be buried with you. With this conclusion, the story gives a clear message. The nameless granddaughter, maybe any woman, is better off without her spouse in life and afterward. Women do not necessarily benefit from their relationship with men and may be off better better off without institutions like marriage. Women are more than wives, and when possible, can do more than marriage. In this story, Mestreta challenges the social institutions that are supposed to benefit women, as well as the idea that women are outside of history. I think I'm out of time. Thank you.
Thank you for that. So next we have George Ramirez, who just completed the second year of a PhD in the Department of Media, Culture, and Communication at New York University. His research focuses on affect, materiality, and embodiment in a variety of popular cultural forms. Using the digital as a physical concept, George looks to the ways that Latinx cultural production is embedded with sensorial knowledges that make it possible for peoples to share pleasures. He studied physics and history as an undergrad at Yale University and holds master's degrees in education and American studies from the University of Pennsylvania and the George Washington University. When he's not contemplating futurity, George likes to dance bachata, go hiking, and listen to funk.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. I have a presentation that should start there. Okay, excellent. Let's see. Wonderful. Okay. Can everybody hear me all right? Is that all right? Okay, excellent. All right. So yeah, my paper is titled, It Don't Make No Difference Whether I Say Goodbye or Adios, Brownness, Pero Like, and Digital Latinx Literature. I'm interested in the things that make Latinxes feel good together, even when there might not be anyone right next to us. I first found this in the corners of the public library where I would escape the world, yet very much be part of it at the same time. While many of these stories became ways of understanding the world, they still always gave me a sense that I wasn't alone. Latinx literature has always been a material repository of cultivation for me. The stuff that made me feel like I was sharing something so real and simply so good, even though at a glance what gave me these feelings were objects. Jose Esteban Munoz best describes this sensation of being in common that I get from books as brownness, articulated best in his posthumous book, The Sense of Brown, in a way that is unstable as it is grounded. He says, at best, we can be attuned to what brownness does in the world, what it performs, and the sense of the world that such performances engender. More striking to me was his articulation of the brownness of things in the following sentence. But we know that some humans feel brown in that they feel differently, that things are brown in that they radiate a different kind of affect. Perhaps these books here, and others like them, have something more to them than their very important collection of symbols to articulate a story. What are the things that make us feel brown, and what is it in their, or in this case, literature's materiality that makes this articulation possible? These questions have many answers, as the world has always been brown. Literature, like the equally elusive media, encompasses a particular materiality embedded with histories that have enacted lives well after their circulation. In Latinx literature now, Ricardo Ortiz invokes Derrida and Dante together to consider the performative elements of the writer and the literary as a question of expression within conditions of precarity. Now, Ortiz says, is a moment when the present discussion can take its own pivotal turn, from the long consideration of Latinidad as a practice just undertaken to an imbricating consideration of literature as itself a practice and a project, always already haunting whatever life and whatever hope Latinidad has ever even able to claim or propose or to pursue. Thinking about the material potentialities that exist within both Latinidad and literature, I look to Munoz and Ortiz together in order to consider what it means to share in those literary pleasures, but in the context of digital media. In doing so, I both historicize narrative forms across literary technologies while simultaneously attending to the affective experiences imminent to the performances they engender. Digital media theory considers the digital a process, much like literature and Latinidad. The digital is a form of representation that is based on identity and distinction, where individual symbols are part of larger wholes. Overall, the digital is a way to organize difference. Latinx literature, like all media, have analog and digital dimensions to them. When understood through a literary and performative lens, the narratives that are shared through social media can simulate similar affective experiences and impact culture akin to traditional physical and written text. In the same way that Latinx literature has been able to simultaneously uphold and challenge constructions of Latinidad, performances of Latinidad within social media groups function under digital media industrial logics that produce difference and serve as material repositories of cultivation through the sensorial experiences they induce for Latinx peoples. First launched on Facebook and YouTube in 2016, Pero Like is a distributed project that looks to make multimedia content for English-speaking Latinxes. In analyzing the narrative forms that exist between two of Pero Like's videos and two Latinx literature texts, I aspire to highlight the ways that one, Latinx social media groups can function as Latinx literature, and two, the ways that the digital appears as a product of its technological mediation. Pero Like videos provide effective sensations similar to Latinx literature through narrative forms within media. Digital Latinx literature thus produces sensory ties among Latinx people and organizes difference through Latinidad. Pero Likes, I transformed into my 4 Latina idols, engages its audience by addressing questions of gender, power, and performance. In a similar way that Gloria Anzaldua's Borderlands La Frontera shifted a paradigm in writing about being a queer Chicana woman, audiovisual media like digital videos on social media supplement existing notions of what it means to be a Latinx woman. This video portrays one of their former staffers, Julissa, on the left, getting several makeovers to look like her Latina idols, Rosie Perez, Rita Moreno, Selena, and Celia Cruz. Julissa explains that she is doing this in honor of Women's History Month, to celebrate, quote, to celebrate the ones who came before us, the ones who are fighting now, and the ones who will come after us. Similar to Anzaldua's claim that there is a rebel in me, a shadow beast, it is a part of me that refuses to take orders from outside authorities, Julissa uses her platform to highlight that Latina womanhood is to be celebrated exactly for the reasons that white patriarchal powers would condemn, describing these women as trailblazers who were, quote, proud to be Latina and just goddamn iconic. Pero Like supplements sentiments like those expressed in Borderlands La Frontera with visuals and sounds so that the audience can symbolize and sense the shadow beast that Anzaldua describes, but within popular Latinx women figures. As she narrates her transformations, Julissa impersonates voices and recounts the ways her role models have made her feel. Through her use of Pero Like's platform, Julissa uses literary tactics within digital media to shift the paradigm of Latinidad into one that directly challenges its dominant discourses. The use of social media complicates racialized symbols by embedding them with effective glimmers. Latinidad becomes the logic and language used to bring these women together, and its colonial histories are directly tied to its inherent anti-Blackness. For Julissa, what brings these icons together is not only how they looked, as that is a very important part of the visual narrative, but also how they inspired her to, quote, be brown and bold without compromising where you came from. The audience can see that Julissa seeks to embody her idols, although she may not look like them or be racialized in the same way. This is particularly apparent when she transforms into Selena, on the right, donning the iconic purple sequin dress that she wore at her last live performance at the Astrodome in 1995. In this way, Julissa creates a third space that Anzaldua describes in her conceptualization of border cultures, a space where people exist among several locations simultaneously. Julissa is able to publicly perform as a woman of different ethnic and racial backgrounds in a way that conveys what Latinidad has the potential to make us feel. Latinxes do not all look one way, and when given the opportunity, they can imagine themselves to be included within these narratives despite the herida abierta that exists across race, gender, sexuality, and the other identity forms that complicate Latinidad. As Julissa shares in the video, Selena's transformation is particularly special because young Julissa would play imaginary dress-up. Selena's legacy and music will continue to leave messages of hope, love, and gratitude in every Latina girl's heart. Perhaps digital performances of Latinidad can instill these same sentiments to more Latina women, regardless of how similar they might look like to Selena or any of their Latina idols. These videos are the symbolic and literal scars left by the hemorrhages that Ansaldúa had to endure. Now there are more and more worlds merging to properly include the vast narratives of different women that are included within Latinx culture and Latinidad at large. In the Thursday, March 28th, 2019 video, Struggles of Being Afro-Latino, Pero Like uses their audience to understand what they might not know or think they know about living life as both Black and Latinx. Stop. What you heard about Afro-Latinidad may be wrong, the video begins, but you must be informed and understand that not only are we here, we are valid, we are valuable, and we have something to say, and yes, we exist. With like those words popping up in the same way that the image shows here. I think this would also be a great way to summarize Pirito Mas's Down These Mean Streets, particularly for the use of the sensory knowledge to begin articulating notions of Black life that exceed the linguistic code. Pero Like's video also does this by addressing what and why these differences exist within Latinidad. In the novel, Piri has an internal dialogue regarding his simultaneous identities. Papa, what's wrong with not being white? I'm me, and I dig myself in the mirror, and it's me. I'm Black, and it don't make no difference whether I say goodbye or adios. It means the same. Piri takes the time to ask these questions himself, but the existing narratives of Afro-Latinidad that have emerged through literature and literary studies at large, particularly online, reinforce the gravity of this question. Here in the video, Latinidad is used as a way to engage with constructions of Blackness beyond the logics of representation. Struggles of Being Afro-Latino illustrates the limits and potential of digital Latinx literature. In similar ways that Piri contemplates Blackness in Down These Mean Streets, the speakers in the video share the constraints of logics of identity, while simultaneously celebrating the sensory experiences and knowledges they have. As Zainab Suarez most bluntly puts it, it's just kind of confusing for like your own identity. In sharing stories of their struggles, they address issues like the melting pot narrative, familial and generational racism, and general anti-Blackness within Latinx peoples. At the same time, Suarez shares that being Black and Latina gives her, quote, the best of both worlds, described by, quote, the rhythm, the food, and of course, quote, the melanin poppin'. Much like brownness is constructed from theories of and scholarship on Blackness, this video articulates shared pleasures and a collective insistence on life through affective experiences like music, food, and being under the sun. At the same time, this video's top comment was from a woman who wrote about not being considered Latina for being, quote, too white, and a Black woman who said that anti-Blackness was only an issue in the United States. In addressing this, I want to underscore that brownness is something that one must become attuned to, for the digital logics of identitarian difference that structure Latinidad are still the representational foundation for these literary performances. Literary performances of Latinidad within digital media are historical processes of production and reception, as well as material repository of sensory resources for survival. Although their existence within social media organizes Latinidad in such a way that reinforces logics of coloniality, the sensory knowledges embedded within these narrative forms structure ways of sharing affect amongst other Latinx peoples. In other words, attending to difference beyond the realm of representation through performance creates ways for brownness to be transferred. While it is crucial to continue to think about digital media and Latinidad in ways that recognize how difference is structured through language, textuality, and discourse, as the digital approach would reinforce, the digital as a whole also makes it possible to consider the otherwise logics that allow for people to share meaningful moments and feelings across space and time, as the analog approach would try. In the conclusion of Latinx Literature Now, Ricardo Ortiz suggests we imagine, quote, that possible world where no one attentional investment in our reading of US Latinx literature trumps any other, if it is for whatever responsible reason worthy of that attention. Latinx literature and literary studies, I'd add, invites us to consider the different realms where reading occurs and the different materialities that have always existed alongside reading. If literature is an experience of life that functions as an otherwise symbolic practice, and if brownness is truly a project that is meant to be enjoyed in the commons, then digital Latinx literature are the literary processes of difference that produce and organize Latinidad. Indeed, they encompass the literary experiences that, in their symbolic and industrial relationships to Latinidad, organize racialized difference within a larger whole. As examples of digital Latinx literature, Pero-Like's videos are part of a history that narrates the multiplicity of experiences that Latinx people encompass. When Latinidad is approached as a project rather than a static identity, digital performances of this cultural form can supplement the project of Latinx literature. Latinos have continued to take advantage of their lived experiences by turning them into entertaining narratives that go beyond the black and white text and broadcast them through different media forms. Although Latinxes are still being commodified by ways of shares, likes, and comments, the expanding stories that are being created and shared through this medium allows Latinidad to be the symbol where other forms of material and sensory knowledge can be further explored. Together, these videos demonstrate that narratives are embedded with opportunities to share affect. By thinking about social media content as Latinx literature, we can begin to see the ways that the analog and the digital have always been part of the reading experience. In attending to these performances as text and content, as well as material and sensory, literature becomes a site to further explore what allows the brown commons to blossom even within digital technologies and the digital era. At the beginning of this talk, I said I was interested in the things that make Latinxes feel good together, even when there may not be anyone right next to us. If I were to try to put into words what it was like to read in the corners of the public library growing up with what I know now, I would describe it as a process too, a very complex, albeit logical process that I can best describe as Latinidad through language and symbol, and at the same time, the sensations within looking, feeling, and imagining that are best described as brownness without limiting its definition. Within those pages, there were moments of organizing new ways of relating to my community through something described as Latinx, but they were also cultivating the feelings that my community gave me in material form. Literature both institutes practice and is instituted practice, but institutional recognition should not be the end goal. The way these videos and books create worlds for us to inhabit seem to suggest otherwise. Digital Latinx literature, therefore, is one way to continue cultivating a commons that has always existed and will continue to do so, regardless of the medium in which it's expressed. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So at this juncture, we'll go ahead and open it up to questions from obviously Cristina and me, as well as the panelists can ask questions of each other. And we can begin. I certainly have questions for both of you, and I'm happy to start off, but if our panelists would like to ask questions, or Cristina, if you would like to also.
You can go ahead.
Okay, so I can start off. So I will start with I had a question for, or maybe more of a comment / question for Lilian. So as you were talking about this particular author and this sort of movement toward deconstructing these archetypes, sort of misogynist archetypes within Mexican literature that cast women in history as either passive or aggressive in these sort of problematic binaries, in order to make space for what I believe you called this actual or like historical reality of women. It brought to mind, and I'm wondering if you're in conversation with US Latina scholarship and literature, but I was thinking about the work of Emma Bettis, who wrote, of course, the, Decolonial Imaginary, and also wrote a novel, a Western set in colonial Texas. And I am forgetting the title of it.
Is it?
And then I was also
Forgetting the Alamo or Blood Memory?
Yes, thank you.
Something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. And then I was also thinking about Esmeralda Santiago's book, Conquistadora. And this takes place, it centers around a female Latina protagonist in colonial Puerto Rico. And one of maybe like the key differences between what you're analyzing in regard to historical reality is that these authors are not, they're sort of imagining into being these historical female figures who go beyond these binaries, and just sort of, I guess, put simply, assuming that, of course, like a queer, what we'd call now like Chicana or Tejana cowgirl existed within colonial Texas who was like a badass and, or like, right. So it's like these US Latina authors are imagining these more agentic figures who must have existed, and sort of like rewriting history in order to sort of challenge this discourse of US national identity formation. So I was just wondering if you could speak to that, or if you'd consider that already, or and I think this also sort of calls for a need for more conversation between those of us who study like Latin American literature and those who do like US Latinx studies, right?
I think when I was looking at this, and it's so hard to decide what to focus on because there's so many ways you can take this. The telling of history has been so linear, and in making it linear, we have excluded, ignored, silenced so many other people that we could take this in myriad of, and that's the difficulty in starting to work on this for me. I can't decide where to focus because we have no queer characters in history. Obviously, queer characters have existed forever. So what are we doing? Women have not been active participants. That's wrong. We know that. When I looked at the colonial era in Mexico, not only were there a lot of Africans brought in to work, especially when they were starting to organize the colony, but also Japanese. So there was a time in history where you could have, and I'm waiting for this novel. I don't know enough to write it, but I'm waiting for this novel where you could have a samurai, an African freedman, and indigenous people all in the same setup, right? Doing things. So anything we can imagine, it seems, definitely could have happened. So this is something that not only needs to be in conversation amongst just Mexican authors or Central American or South American, but also Latinx here in the US, but also with the US American experience as well, right? We've seen the 1619 Project get all kinds of heat because they're insisting on the inclusion of history that makes us uncomfortable, right? And so if we have this Senate, for instance, in the US that is completely white male dominated, but the nation was created by people that are not white males, the question arises, why do we have the power structure? And I think that we just need to be, we need to all be in conversation. It's all pretty much the same theme. How has the power structure co-opted, not just the historical narrative, but everything that helps prop it up, including literature, right? Like Boston Fuentes. These are literature guys. These are not historians, which is why we shouldn't believe any history that comes from them. But the idea is that they're propping up this narrative where white men have created the world, and therefore that's why they run it, right? To a certain extent, that men, and especially white, that aristocratic tendency. And so it's, you're right. Yes, they all should be in conversation. And I've been reading, I haven't read those two authors, no, I will. But I've been reading also Cuban American authors that are doing the same thing. There's so many people working on this reimagining and opening up history to be more inclusive. And I think that it's a fertile ground. I mean, because history just lends itself to literature, given that it's so fantastical sometimes.
Yeah, no, I was just thinking, like, to the end there, as you're talking, that it's very interesting and telling that they're choosing to rewrite, history through engaging these different genres, right, and literature and fiction, right? Yeah.
And I think it's the way.
So thank you.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I think it's the way literature can help the process, right? We're doing what we can, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, and I consider that pretty powerful work, as I imagine we all do, being scholars of literature. Then George, I often use, by the way, Pedal-like and sort of other forms of digital media alongside sort of what we think of now as traditional text in my Intro to Latinx Literature course, so you made me feel good. I had a question about, and let me make sure I'm understanding what you're arguing, that sort of traditional literary texts in tandem with sort of with digital media is producing this sense of brownness and the sort of brown affective economy, and that digital media and literature are not the same thing, but they sort of collaborate again to create a sense of collective brownness. And I was wondering if, and I also like the idea of like how you're moving away from like the text as a text, but as a kind of object and affective object, but that's another question. What I wanted to ask you about first is, you commented that these digital texts are marshaling kind of like literary strategies. And I was just wondering if you could say a bit more about that. And this might be a silly question, but I'm wondering if texts, more traditional texts, also use digital strategies. That makes sense.
Yes, that's actually, those are all great questions. Just to clarify, so the first one is about like expanding more on the literary strategies, and then the second one was kind of talking a little bit more about how like the traditional text has been doing digital things as well, right? Okay. Okay, let me just write that down.
Yeah, I'm preparing you for
okay.
job interviews by asking you multiple questions.
Yeah, no, this is right. This is good because, and I'm trying to learn that strategy of like writing things down so I don't forget. As you know, you get all inspired by answering. Okay, so I understand literature and literary studies very much as like Ricardo Ortiz talked about it, in terms of understanding that there are these, that it exists in a material form, there is discourse, there's language and very structural sort of aspects of what literature does. And at the same time, what I like that Ricardo Ortiz does is that like he thinks of the literary as also doing more than that through those same sort of logics, which actually reminded me a lot of what Lilian is doing with history, because I think there's a lot of these narratives that are being told through history with a capital H that are really doing other things, like she described in her paper. So I think of these literary strategies in these digital texts as like the language and the words that they are choosing very strategically to convey a message about pan-ethnicity and Latinidad. But I wanna, and I didn't get to talk about this as much, but I think they also do they have like a plot, and they have a sort of, they have a lot of thematic, like there's a lot of thematic repetition between these like physical texts and these digital texts, right? So the strategies that I probably should have been a little bit more clear on are about this like plot, theme, but also like what I want to add in there is like the sort of like sensory aspect that literature gives us, the sort of like shared experience that comes with that as well, which I think are literary strategies, but are probably not usually thought of, first, as Ricardo says. So that would be my quick answer to that first question. I love the question about books doing, or like how do texts do digital work, because what my research focuses on broadly is how these two ways of thinking about materiality have always been there. And I think in one way we could address that question would be obviously through like structuralism and semiotics and like all these different sort of very logical kind of like history, like sort of one path to like understanding what this definition of Latinidad might be, right? So I think that's the way that books have been doing that in a digital way. But I think we could also think about how different strategies of difference, kind of like the footnote, the index, sort of these different ways of like organizing and kind of being able to say that Latinx, Latina, Latino is this and not that, that these sort of ideas that the author is trying to convey exist in like this italicized word as opposed to this non-italicized word, that I think the digital components of physical text have manifested themselves in these sort of strategies of differentiation through the words, but also through like sections of books and like the ways that certain parts of text don't come out in the primary part, but like at the end or in the footnote or stuff like that. Does that answer the questions a little clearly? Okay.
Yeah. No, thank you for that.
Mm-hmm.
So do you all have, and I'm sorry, because I'm using my phone, I can only see George's screen, but I wanted to see if the panelists had questions or.
Yeah, I just have a comment that I was, first of all, congratulations, both of you did a really great job. But it was as Lilian, I think you were talking in response to one of Katie's questions, I was struck now by the overlap, I think, between your presentations. And so as I was listening to your talk, Lilian, I was thinking about how, or why, maybe why is a better way of phrasing it, why historical fiction has been kind of the go-to genre for a lot of Latina writers, but particularly for queer writers, not just Latina, but I'm thinking also of somebody like Michael Nava, right, who was known as he does detective fiction, but then in 2014 he publishes this beautiful novel called The City of Palaces, in which he's queering Mexican history. And so I'm curious about why historical fiction seems to be kind of the purview of a lot of Latina, especially queer Latinx writers. And then George, as you were talking about your paper, I was thinking about the beautiful digital archive of Chicana por mi raza. And so seeing the overlap of how Chicana por mi raza is, it's a digital archive. You can just Google it, and it's free, it's accessible, and their work is really to try to unsettle the archive of how the archive has always been a site of privilege, limited access, and erasure. And so I see this overlap, right, between your papers and how the kind of digital media is a way of addressing those who have been rendered invisible. In the case of Chicana por mi raza, all of the Chicana activists whose stories were never in the text. And so now there's an archive, right? It includes a lot of elements that perhaps you wouldn't see in a traditional library archive. There's photos, cards, things like that, as a way to say that we need to rethink what we imagine archival material to look like, to feel like, to be. So I don't have a question. It's just more of, I was really struck by this overlap of, in the case of digital archives, also as a way to give everybody access, right? You don't have to be a student or a professor at a particular university. You can just simply go online, and how this digital archive is trying to set the record straight by saying Chicanas were always there. They were always there in the activist movement, even if they were erased by, Rudy Acuña and the kind of old vanguard Chicano movement scholar. So that's it. But I really liked your papers, both of you.
Thank you. I would actually, to your, and also to George, to your comment, the idea that representation matters, right? We've been hearing this in US politics, and about Hollywood, and I think that's what we're trying to do with history, right? Representation matters. You can't see yourself in politics today if you're not part of history, and to a certain extent, you're all of a sudden everyone's a newcomer except the colonizing forces, and that just seems absurd, right? And I think that's what we're societally reacting to, including the arts. And to George, you say that Latinidad is something about how we feel, right? It makes us feel good because we're together, but it's also about empowering, right? Politics into political activity. And when I see Pero like, for me as a Central American, as a Salvadoreña who doesn't see much representation because we're just not as numerous, it's refreshing, right? Because all of a sudden I'm also represented in Latinidad and brownness in my specific cultural milieu, not just in the general, right? And so I think that's the representation is refreshing. But it's also, and it makes you feel good, yes, but it's also politically empowering,
right?
And it makes you feel like you should have a voice. And I think that's what we're all trying to do. And I think that's why the historical narrative is so attractive now. No, we've always been here, whether it be queer, women, color, whatever it is.
I actually want to follow up to that, and thank you, Lilian, for saying that. Because there's whole conversation of like representation matters, which I'm glad you brought up. But it's also that the fact that like in a materialist sort of media ways, like representation like matters and has existed in like these ways outside of, like you were saying in your paper, like outside of these like what we deem to be the like institutional texts that tell us how things are to be represented too. So I like what we're both doing, because I think there's an aspect to saying that representation matters, but then feeling that the conversation ends at having another Central American, a fellow Central American on the screen, which is beautiful and powerful. And like you said, like politically, like it's an urgency, like it's a very real thing. But at the same time, we know that, Salvadoreños have been out here forever. So, and that they have mattered and they have been represented outside of, a book or outside of a particular screen. And even though, right, there's this sort of like political importance to it, I think that there's also there's also a need to make sure that we see how representation manifests itself outside of being able to just like say, this is X, this is Y, and this is Z, which is necessary for its sort of specificity. But even in the historical context, it's like things have been represented just in ways that we probably haven't picked up on, or people who have been able to pick up on it have never been able to have access to those sources. So I feel what you're saying, and Christina, that was a great comment. So thanks. Yeah.
Okay, so unless we have any other comments or questions, that concludes this panel and this recording.
Okay, so I guess I can stop the recording right now. Stop cloud. Cloud recording.